Late November 1967, a soundstage at Paramount Studios in Hollywood, dressed to look like the interior of a Manhattan apartment. Fake walls, rented furniture, windows that open onto nothing. The lights are hot. A film crew is working. At the center of it all, a 22-year-old actress in costume, mid-scene, inhabiting the role of a young wife who is slowly discovering that the people she trusts have been conspiring against her. The production is 22 days behind schedule. She's in every shot. And then a man walks into the set who does not belong there. He is a lawyer. He is carrying divorce papers sent by her husband, Frank Sinatra. He hands them to her in front of the crew. The cameras do not stop. The public had been told this was a love story. The voice of America, the most magnetic entertainer of his generation, marrying a 21-year-old television actress in Las Vegas. The photographs showed glamour, champagne, a fairy tale. What the photographs did not show was the contract underneath. A marriage that worked only as long as the younger person in it never wanted anything of her own. This is the story of Frank Sinatra and Mia Farrow, of a 16-month marriage that was sold as romance and enforced as obedience, of a young woman who was told to leave a film and refused, and of the machinery that punished her for it. It is a story about what happens when a culture decides a powerful man should never be told no, and a woman says it anyway. But that moment on the Paramount soundstage and the lawyer, the papers, the crew pretending not to watch, did not arrive without warning. It arrived because two people had built a marriage on terms that only one of them had written, and because the younger one had finally, quietly, refused to keep living by them. To understand how a 22-year-old actress ended up being served divorce papers in front of a film crew by a man she never saw coming, you have to go back to who these two people were before they ever met, and to the version of Hollywood that made their marriage look like a fairy tale instead of what it actually was. Frank Sinatra, by the middle of the 1960s, was not simply famous. He was a fixed point in American culture, a man whose name had meant something specific to the country for more than 2 decades and whose presence in a room rearranged the physics of that room the moment he entered it. Born in Hoboken, New Jersey, on December 12, 1915, the only child of Italian immigrants, his father, Marty, a bantamweight boxer turned fireman, his mother, Dolly, a formidable presence in local Democratic ward politics, he had clawed his way from a tenement neighborhood into the kind of stardom that bends the world around itself. By the time he was 50 years old, he had been the voice that carried young women through the Second World War, singing with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra, and then breaking out as a solo act, whose effect on audiences bordered on hysteria. He had been the actor who won an Academy Award for his role in From Here to Eternity in 1954, resurrecting a career that everyone in Hollywood had already written off. He had been the singer who, working with the arranger Nelson Riddle, recorded a series of albums through the late 50s, In the Wee Small Hours, Songs for Swingin' Lovers, Only the Lonely, that remain some of the most enduring works in American popular music. And by the early 60s, he had become the undisputed center of the Rat Pack, that loose brotherhood of performers. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, whose Las Vegas act at the Sands Hotel traded in boozy improvisation, casual misogyny, and a swagger that the culture was willing to call the height of sophistication. There is something worth understanding about the kind of power Sinatra held in that era, because it was not just celebrity. It was influence that blurred the line between entertainment, politics, and intimidation. His mother Dolly had been a domineering force in both Hoboken politics and in his early career, a woman who wielded local power with a directness that her son absorbed and amplified into something much larger. His FBI file ran to more than 1,000 pages, documenting contacts and associations that touched racketeering investigations and organized crime figures whose names appeared in federal surveillance reports. His friendships extended to presidents. He had campaigned for John F. Kennedy, helped arrange entertainment for the inauguration, and then been quietly discarded by the Kennedy White House when the administration decided his associations were too politically dangerous to maintain. That rejection stung him in the ways that people around him noticed for years. He was not a man who tolerated being dropped. His displeasure could end careers. The people who worked for him, agents, lawyers, press representatives, a personal apparatus that functioned with institutional efficiency, operated less like employees and more like an extension of his will, managing his image and executing his wishes with a speed that most people associated with corporations, not individuals. When Frank Sinatra wanted something done, it got done. When he wanted someone gone, that person was gone. That is not gossip. That is the architecture of his life. And it matters enormously because the woman he married in 1966 was 21 years old, had been nationally famous for roughly 2 years, and had no architecture of her own at all. Mia Farrow arrived in the world on February 9th, 1945, in Los Angeles. And the world she arrived in was already saturated with Hollywood. Not Hollywood as fantasy, but Hollywood as the family business. The thing people in her house talked about at dinner the way other families talked about plumbing or law. Her father was John Farrow, an Australian-born director and screenwriter who had worked steadily in the studio system for decades, a complicated man with a reputation for both talent and difficult behavior. Her mother was Maureen O'Sullivan, the Irish-born actress best remembered for playing Jane opposite Johnny Weissmuller's Tarzan in a string of films through the 1930s. Together they produced 7 children. The household was large, Catholic, chaotic in the way that big families are, and steeped in the language and rhythms of filmmaking. Sets, call times, production schedules, the particular exhaustion of creative labor. These were not exotic concepts for the Farrow children. They were the texture of ordinary life. Mia's childhood, however, was not the gilded thing the press would later imply. At 9 years old, she contracted polio during an epidemic and spent weeks in isolation at a Los Angeles hospital, separated from her family, confined to a ward where she could hear other children suffering around her. The isolation planted something in her, a familiarity with fear, with being small and alone in a system that could not be argued with. Her older brother Michael was killed in a plane crash in 1958 when Mia was 13. A loss that cracked through the family with the kind of force that large families absorb slowly and unevenly, each child processing the absence differently, the dinner table rearranging itself around a missing chair. And then in 1963, her father John died of a heart attack. Mia was 18. The man who had been both the household's creative engine and its most volatile presence was gone. And what he left behind was not money or stability, but a set of values about work. Specifically, that you showed up, that you honored your commitments, that the film mattered more than your comfort. Those values would cost Mia her marriage, but that was still years away. What Mia wanted after her father's death was motion. She left Los Angeles, moved to New York, took small theater work, and auditioned with the particular relentlessness of someone who has already learned that the world does not pause for grief. Within months, she landed the role that would reshape everything. Alison Mackenzie on the primetime soap opera Peyton Place, which debuted in the fall of 1964 and ran 3 nights a week on ABC. She was 19. The show made her, almost overnight, a nationally recognized face. Thin blonde, enormous-eyed, photographed constantly, and packaged by the press with a single word that followed her like a shadow. The word was waif. It was meant as a compliment. It was also a cage because the actual Mia Farrow, the one who had survived polio, buried a brother, lost her father, and relocated across the country alone before she was old enough to drink, was considerably tougher than the image suggested. The public saw fragility. The industry saw a girl who showed up on time, hit her marks, and worked without complaint. Her mother, the actress, understood the difference between the two. Her father, the director, had understood it too. That understanding, the knowledge that work is not ornamental, that it is identity, that you owe something to the production you have joined, that would matter enormously when the time came to choose between a husband and a film. She met Frank Sinatra on the 20th Century Fox lot sometime in 1964. She was shooting Peyton Place on one part of the studio. He was nearby, filming Von Ryan's Express. The details of their first encounter are soft to the edges. She later said she noticed him, that there was an introduction, that the age difference registered, and then somehow stopped registering. She was 19. He was 49. A 30-year gap that the culture of the mid-60s was willing to romanticize rather than question. Because the culture of the mid-60s had very specific ideas about what an older, powerful man was entitled to, and what a young, beautiful woman should feel grateful for. Mia told her mother almost at once, and Maureen O'Sullivan, to her credit or her miscalculation, did not object. The courtship accelerated from there in the way that courtships accelerated around Frank Sinatra, on his schedule, in his spaces, at his pace. There is a story Farrow told years later that captures the dynamic of those early months with almost painful clarity. Early in the relationship, Sinatra flew her out to his home in Palm Springs, a compound that was famous in its own right, a desert estate where presidents and mobsters had both been guests, where the architecture itself seemed designed to communicate that the men who lived here operated on a scale most people would never touch. Mia brought her cat. She was 20 years old, sitting in the living room of a man whose world was built on foundations she had never seen up close. And she asked him practically where she should put the litter box. He did not answer the question. He kissed her instead. She told the story warmly with affection, but it contains the whole future in miniature. She is thinking about logistics. He is redirecting her attention. She is trying to navigate his world on practical terms. He is absorbing her into it on emotional ones. The litter box question never gets answered. In a sense, that is the story of the marriage. The practical questions. Where does my work go? Where does my identity live? What happens to the person I was becoming? Never got answered either. They just got kissed away, deferred, overridden by the sheer gravitational force of being loved by Frank Sinatra. They married in Las Vegas on July 19th, 1966. Farrow was 21. Sinatra was 50. The ceremony was small and fast. She later said she learned only the day before when the wedding would actually happen. She wore whatever she had in her closet. That detail is easy to read as bohemian spontaneity, as the kind of charming carelessness that young brides in the 60s were allowed. It is also possible to read it as a woman whose life was being arranged around someone else's timetable so completely that she did not even have time to choose her own dress. The photographs from that day show two people smiling. The Sands Hotel provided the cake. The press consumed the images for weeks. What the photographs did not show, and could not show, was the unspoken contract underneath the smiles. That this marriage would operate on his terms, that her role was to be present and beautiful and available, and that the moment she needed something of her own, the arrangement would reveal itself for what it had always been. What Frank Sinatra wanted from a wife was not complicated, and he was willing to say it plainly, both before and after the marriage ended. He wanted a woman who did not work. He wanted dinner ready when he arrived home at night. He wanted availability, warmth, companionship, and the particular kind of quiet that a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered tends to require from the one person who shares his private life. He told the press, in language that was later widely repeated, that he was a good provider and could not understand why a woman would want anything other than what he offered. Farrow herself recalled this as his stated position, not something she inferred, but something he said out loud, as though the argument were so self-evident that it barely needed making. That is not a private thought uncovered by biographers. That is a public declaration of terms, a contract written by one party and presented to the other as love. What Mia wanted was harder to name, in part because she was still in the process of becoming the person who would eventually name it. She wanted romance, and she had it. She wanted safety. And for a time, the fortress of Sinatra's fame provided something that resembled it. She wanted the thrill of being chosen by someone the entire world already treated like a monument. And that thrill was real and intoxicating and should not be minimized. She later described herself as having been less mature than any other 19-year-old she had known, and she called herself an impossibly immature teenager in retrospect. Those words matter because they keep the story honest. She was young, she was romantic, and she entered this marriage without fully understanding what she was trading away, but she also wanted, somewhere beneath the romance and the dazzle of his attention, to work. Not as a hobby, not as something she would do until motherhood arrived or until the novelty wore off, as an identity. She was the daughter of a director and an actress. Performance was the family trade, the inheritance that had nothing to do with money, and the thing her father had done every day until the day his heart stopped. That inheritance, quiet as it was, would prove to be the one asset that Frank Sinatra's apparatus could not acquire, manage, or shut down. For a time, the arrangement held. She left Peyton Place at his urging, walked away from the show that had made her famous because her husband did not want a wife who worked. She traveled with him while he made films. She accompanied him to Las Vegas, where the Rat Pack held court and the nights ran long and loud and were designed entirely for older men with large appetites and larger egos. Farrow later described those evenings with a kind of bemused honesty that is more revealing than any accusation would have been. Sitting at tables full of men twice her age, trying to make conversation about anything that was not show business or gambling, falling asleep before midnight in rooms that would not quiet down until dawn. She was not miserable. She was not abused in any way the era had language for. She was simply young, and the world she had entered was not built for someone like her. It was built for Frank, and for the people who orbited Frank, and for the particular performance of American masculinity that Frank had spent 3 decades perfecting. She was the newest presence in a room that had no interest in rearranging itself for her comfort, so she rearranged herself instead. The photographs from this period show the couple the public was meant to see. Elegant, affectionate, surrounded by the currency of Sinatra celebrity, recording studios, yacht decks, hotel lobbies where everyone knew his name. The wedding cake from the sands. The candid shots that always seemed to find Mia looking upward at Frank. The physical geometry of their heights and ages reinforcing the story the culture wanted to tell about them. The great man and the girl who adored him. The pictures did their job. They were consumed by magazine readers who saw romance where the more honest reading was hierarchy, a hierarchy that happened to be photogenic. But underneath the surface, the structural mismatch was already doing its quiet, corrosive work. A 50-year-old man whose daily life ran on appetite, performance, and control had married a 21-year-old woman who, by every account, was growing quietly restless in the gorgeous cage he had built for her. She accompanied him. She smiled. She was present at every dinner, every premiere, every recording session where he wanted her nearby. And she was slowly disappearing. Not because he was cruel in any way that the era would have recognized as cruelty, but because the role he had written for her did not contain a single line where she got to be anything other than his. The marriage was functional, even warm, for exactly as long as Mia remained movable. The question nobody was asking yet, and the question that would detonate everything within a year, was what would happen when she stopped. The haircut happened somewhere in this period, and it is worth pausing on because it reveals more than it should. In 1966, Farrow cut her own hair short, a dramatic departure from the long blonde waves that had defined her Peyton Place image. She did it herself. Later, when she was cast in Rosemary's Baby, the hairstylist Vidal Sassoon trimmed and refined the pixie cut in a heavily publicized session that Paramount treated as a media event, packaging the transformation as fashion news. But the transformation had already happened privately, on Farrow's own terms, at a moment when she was losing control of nearly everything else. The system around her, Sinatra's apparatus, the studio publicity machine, the press that sold her image to the public, was constantly deciding which version of Mia the world would consume. The haircut, however it read to the cameras, was one of the few things that was entirely hers. By 1967, the marriage was barely a year old, and the fundamental contradiction at its center had become impossible to ignore, at least from the inside. Mia Farrow had done what was asked. She had left her show. She had traveled with her husband. She had played the role of the decorative, available wife. But the restlessness that had driven her from her mother's house at 18, onto a television set at 19, and into a famous man's orbit at 20 had not disappeared. It had merely been waiting, and in the summer of 1967, it found something to attach itself to. Roman Polanski offered her Rosemary's Baby, and everything changed. Paramount cast Farrow in July 1967. Principal photography began in New York on August 21st and moved to the studio's Hollywood soundstages by the end of the month. The film was a psychological thriller about a young wife in a Manhattan apartment building whose body and autonomy are gradually stolen from her by the people she trusts most: her husband, her neighbors, the systems and institutions that are supposed to protect her, but instead conspire to use her. Polanski built the picture around Farrow's face, around her ability to project innocence curdling into terror, trust collapsing into paranoia. She was the center of every frame. She was in virtually every scene, carrying the emotional weight of the entire production on a frame that the press was still calling fragile. The role demanded everything she had: her concentration, her stamina, her willingness to inhabit a character whose nightmare is that the people closest to her have already decided her fate without consulting her. And she gave it. For the first time since her wedding, she had something that belonged to her, something that required her presence, not as an ornament, but as a professional whose talent justified the money being spent. She was not Frank Sinatra's wife on that set. She was the lead of a major motion picture. And that distinction, small as it might sound, was the thing the marriage could not survive. Sinatra had expected her to co-star with him in The Detective, a Fox production that was already ahead of schedule and needed her sooner than planned. When Rosemary's Baby began falling behind, the production was eventually reported to be 22 days over schedule. The collision became unavoidable. Fox, trying to recover its investment, offered to pay Paramount's costs if the studio would pause production and release Farrow to come do Sinatra's picture first. Paramount refused. The film was too far along. It depended on her. She was the movie, and no scheduling concession could change that. What had begun as a marital disagreement was now an institutional standoff. Two studios, one superstar husband, and a 22-year-old actress whose labor had become the contested territory. The private demand, like come home, leave the film, be my wife, had collided with an industrial reality that did not care about Frank Sinatra's domestic arrangements. Farrow's refusal to leave was not framed as a rebellion. It was framed almost conservatively in the language of the household she had grown up in. She could not walk off a nearly finished production. She was in every shot. She had roughly 1 month of work remaining. She was the daughter of a director, and directors' daughters understood what it meant to abandon a film. It meant betraying everyone who had built it alongside you. She told Sinatra as much. She believed, or wanted to believe, that he would understand. But what Sinatra heard was not professional obligation. He heard refusal. He heard a wife choosing another man's production over her husband's authority. And Frank Sinatra, the man whose displeasure could end careers, whose personal apparatus executed his wishes with institutional efficiency, who had not been told no by anyone in his life and accepted it, did not sit with the refusal. He acted. On November 23, 1967, his press agent, James Mahoney, released a statement to the media announcing that Frank Sinatra and Mia Farrow were separating. The marriage had lasted 16 months. The fairy tale, the one the press had sold and the public had purchased and displayed on coffee tables across America, was officially cracked. The gossip columns treated it as another celebrity breakup, filed it alongside the other glamorous wreckages of the decade. What they did not report, what most of them did not yet know, was that the cracking was not complete, that the separation announcement was not the punishment. It was the preamble, the full weight of what Frank Sinatra's displeasure actually looked like, the mechanism by which it would be delivered, the place it would be staged, and the deliberate precision of its timing. It had not yet arrived. Mia Farrow still had to go back to work the next morning, to a soundstage built to look like a Manhattan apartment where a young wife slowly loses control over her own body and her own fate. And someone was already on his way to that set carrying papers. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There's so much more to this family that the public never saw, and we're just getting started. The papers had not yet been filed. The separation announcement, released to the press on November 23rd, was public knowledge. But the legal machinery that would formalize the end of the marriage was still in motion, still being managed by the people whose job it was to manage Frank Sinatra's life. And on the Paramount lot, in a soundstage dressed to look like the interior of a Manhattan apartment building called the Bramford, Mia Farrow went back to work. That is the detail that matters most in understanding the weeks that followed. The announcement changed the public story, but it did not change the production schedule. The film still needed her. Polanski still needed her. The crew, the camera operators, the lighting technicians, the script supervisors, all of them needed her to walk onto that set every morning and inhabit a character whose central experience was the slow, suffocating realization that the people closest to her had already decided her fate. The parallel between the woman and the role she was playing had been quietly present since the first day of shooting, and now it was becoming impossible to ignore. To understand what November and December of 1967 felt like for Mia Farrow, you have to see the full scope of what was pressing against her from every direction, because this was not a simple argument between husband and wife. It had become an institutional collision, a problem that involved contracts, production budgets, studio executives, legal representatives, and the reputations of some of the most powerful figures in the entertainment industry, all converging on a single question that nobody was willing to ask plainly. Did this 22-year-old woman have the right to finish a job? Start with the studios. Paramount had a film that was behind schedule but nearly complete. The investment was substantial. Roman Polanski's vision for the picture depended entirely on Farrow's performance. She was in virtually every frame, and replacing her at this stage would have meant reshooting the bulk of the movie, an expense and a delay that no studio would have accepted willingly. Paramount was not protecting Mia Farrow out of affection or principle. Paramount was protecting its investment, but the effect was the same. The studio held the line, refused to release her, and in doing so became the institutional counterweight to Sinatra's demand. On the other side, 20th Century Fox had The Detective, Sinatra's picture, a crime drama already running ahead of its production calendar, and Fox wanted Farrow for a supporting role alongside her husband. And when Rosemary's Baby fell further behind, Fox made an offer that revealed how seriously the industry took Sinatra's displeasure. The studio proposed to cover Paramount's costs, essentially paying a rival studio to pause its own film so that Sinatra's wife could come fulfill the role he expected her to play. Paramount said no. The refusal was not personal. It was financial and practical. But to Sinatra, it must have felt like the entire apparatus of Hollywood choosing Polanski's movie over his authority. And in a sense, it was. Now track Sinatra's position, because the script that tells this story honestly cannot reduce him to a one-dimensional villain, even as it refuses to excuse what he did. Frank Sinatra was 52 years old in November 1967. He had spent more than 3 decades in an industry that rewarded his talent, indulged his temper, and organized itself around his preferences. He had married a woman who was young enough to be his daughter, and he had married her with the explicit expectation, stated publicly on the record, that she would not work. For a time, she had complied. She had left Peyton Place. She had traveled with him. She had sat at his tables, attended his sessions, lived inside his schedule. And now she was on someone else's set, in someone else's film, working for someone else's director, and the production was running long enough that it was interfering with his own picture. You have to understand what that looked like from inside Sinatra's worldview, not to agree with it, but to feel the logic that made his response feel, to him, not just justified but necessary. He was a man for whom loyalty and availability were the same thing. A wife who chose to stay on a film set rather than come to his was not exercising professional judgment. She was committing an act of disloyalty. And disloyalty in Sinatra's universe was the one thing that could never be tolerated. Because his entire life, his career, his friendships, his mythology, was built on the premise that the people in his orbit stayed in his orbit until he decided otherwise. There is something else beneath the scheduling dispute that deserves attention because it helps explain the ferocity of what came next. Sinatra was not just losing a domestic argument, he was losing it publicly. The entertainment press knew about the production delays. Industry insiders knew that Fox had tried to pry Farrow loose and failed. The longer Rosemary's Baby continued shooting with Mia at its center, the more visible her independence became. Not as a political statement, not as feminism in any language the era would have used, but simply as a fact that anyone paying attention could observe. Frank Sinatra's wife was working. Frank Sinatra's wife had chosen a film over Frank Sinatra. In an industry built on the currency of reputation, that was not a private embarrassment, it was a public one. And Sinatra, whose relationship to public embarrassment had always been to eliminate its source rather than endure it, began moving toward a response that would match the scale of the insult he felt he had received. And while the marriage was cracking open privately, the machinery of Hollywood image-making was doing something almost perverse. It was building Mia Farrow into a bigger star. The publicity apparatus around Rosemary's Baby was already in motion. The Vidal Sassoon haircut had been turned into a media event, cameras, press coverage, the transformation of a private act into public spectacle. Paramount was investing in Farrow's image because Farrow's image was now worth investing in. She was being sold to the public not as Sinatra's wife, but as something more valuable to a studio, a leading lady with a face the camera loved and a role that would define her. The same months that were destroying the fairy tale were simultaneously creating the actress the public would remember long after the fairy tale was forgotten. There is a particular cruelty in that doubling. The woman who was losing her marriage was watching her professional value rise in direct proportion to her personal wreckage, and neither process waited for the other. They ran in parallel, like two trains on adjacent tracks heading in opposite directions, and Mia Farrow was standing on both. Meanwhile, on the Paramount soundstage, the film itself was becoming a strange and uncomfortable mirror. Rosemary Woodhouse, the character Farrow was inhabiting for 12 hours a day, is a young wife who moves into a new apartment with her husband and gradually discovers that the people around her, including her own spouse, have made decisions about her body, her pregnancy, and her future without her knowledge or consent. The husband, played by John Cassavetes, is charming and ambitious and willing to trade his wife's autonomy for his own advancement. The neighbors are warm and intrusive and ultimately predatory. The institutions that should protect Rosemary, her doctor, the building's social architecture, the assumption that a husband acts in his wife's interest, are all compromised. Critics and scholars would later describe the film as an indelible portrait of a woman in extremis, victimized by her spouse, by authority, by society, and by the systems that claim to care for her. The script does not need to push the parallel between Rosemary Woodhouse and Mia Farrow too hard. It only needs to let the audience notice that while Farrow was playing a woman whose autonomy was being negotiated away by powerful men in a closed system, her actual autonomy was being negotiated away by powerful men in a closed system. Her husband, his lawyers, the studios, and the press agents whose job it was to manage the public narrative of what was happening. Now widen the frame to see the full cast of figures pressing against Farrow in those final weeks, because the marriage was not collapsing in isolation. It was collapsing inside an industry. Mickey Rudin was Sinatra's attorney, a well-known entertainment lawyer whose client list reflected the upper tier of Hollywood power. Rudin did not merely advise Sinatra on legal matters. He executed Sinatra's decisions. And in this case, the decision he was preparing to execute was the formal dissolution of the marriage, delivered not in a lawyer's office or a private meeting, but in the one location where Mia's independence was most visible. James Mahoney was Sinatra's press agent, the man who had released the separation announcement to the media, managing the public narrative so that the story read as mutual and civilized, even as the private reality was becoming neither. Roman Polanski, the director, occupied a different position entirely. He needed Farrow to finish his film, and his film needed Farrow to be emotionally available for work that required her to perform vulnerability, terror, and disorientation on camera, while her actual life was providing all three in abundance. Whether Polanski understood what Farrow was going through personally is not well documented in the available record. What is documented is that the production continued, that the schedule demanded her presence, and that she gave it. And then there was Paramount itself, represented in the era by figures like Robert Evans, the head of production, whose instinct for commercial material had helped greenlight the project. The studio's role in this story is not heroic. Paramount did not keep Farrow on the picture because it believed in her right to work. It kept her because the movie was too expensive to abandon and too dependent on her to recast. But the effect was that Paramount became, almost by accident, the institution that said no to Frank Sinatra, a thing that very few institutions in 1960s Hollywood were willing to do. The studio's refusal to release Farrow was the wall against which Sinatra's demand finally broke. And once the demand broke, the punishment followed. Through all of this, the studio negotiations, the press management, the legal preparations, Farrow's own position remained remarkably consistent and remarkably simple. She could not leave the film. She was in every shot. She had approximately 1 month of work remaining. She was a professional who had been raised by professionals, and the idea of walking off a nearly finished production was, to her, not a negotiable point, but a moral impossibility. She framed it in exactly those terms when she spoke about it later. She was the daughter of a director and an actress, and she could not leave a movie. There was no liberation rhetoric in her refusal. There was no manifesto. There was no attempt to humiliate him or provoke a confrontation. There was only the stubbornness of someone who had been raised to believe that the work mattered, and that you did not betray the people who were counting on you. That is what made Sinatra's response so devastating in retrospect. He was not punishing rebellion. He was punishing fidelity. Fidelity to a set of values that Farrow's own parents had instilled in her long before she ever heard the name Sinatra. Values that had nothing to do with defiance and everything to do with the simple, unglamorous principle of finishing what you started. What makes this period so difficult to narrate without falling into easy categories is that Farrow was not yet the person the public would later know. She was not the seasoned actress, not the humanitarian, not the woman who would eventually build a life defined by work and advocacy and a family of her own choosing. She was 22. She was frightened. She later said she had believed, genuinely, that the marriage could survive this disagreement. That Frank would be angry, yes, but that his anger would pass, that the love would outlast the scheduling conflict, that the whole thing would resolve itself, the way arguments resolve in marriages where both people ultimately want the same future. She was wrong. But the wrongness is not naivete alone. It is the wrongness of someone who had not yet learned how power works in intimate relationships. Specifically, that a man who has spent his entire life exercising control does not suddenly stop exercising it because the person he controls has a good reason for saying no. The good reason is irrelevant. The saying no is the offense. The options, by late November, had narrowed to nothing. Could Farrow have left the film? In theory, yes. She could have walked off the set, surrendered the role, and returned to Sinatra's orbit. The marriage might have survived. Her career almost certainly would not have, and the production she abandoned would have been crippled. Dozens of people's work discarded because one man's ego required the sacrifice. Could Sinatra have tolerated her staying? The available record says no. His worldview did not include a category for a wife who chose work over availability, and his emotional vocabulary did not include a word for compromise that did not also mean surrender. Could the studios have engineered a gentler resolution? A pause, a scheduling accommodation that gave both pictures what they needed? Perhaps, but by November, the positions had hardened beyond accommodation. Money, pride, contractual obligations, and ego had all calcified into a situation where no one was willing to move. That is the architecture of the tragedy that followed. Not a sudden explosion, but a slow tightening, a narrowing of exits, until the only door left was the one that led to the soundstage where Mia Farrow was working, and through it walked a lawyer carrying divorce papers. The exact date of what happened next is not pinned to a single confirmed day in the sources available. What is established is that it occurred in late November 1967, after the November 23rd separation announcement, and in the same period documented by a November 27th Los Angeles Times report. The production was still active. The soundstage at Paramount was dressed as the interior of the Bramford apartment, the fictional Manhattan building where Rosemary Woodhouse's life unravels. The walls were fake. The furniture was set decoration. The windows looked out onto nothing. But the work happening inside those false walls was real, and the people doing it were real. And the woman at the center of it all was carrying the weight of a production that had cost Paramount months of effort and significant money, and that could not, under any circumstances, afford to lose her now. The lights were hot, they always were on a soundstage, and the kind of industrial illumination that made actors sweat through their makeup and forced the crew to work in shifts. The set was built to mimic domestic intimacy, but there was nothing intimate about it. It was a workplace. Technicians moved equipment, assistants carried call sheets. Polanski, precise and demanding, orchestrated each setup with the relentlessness that had already pushed the schedule 22 days past its original end date. Farrow was working. She was not resting between takes in a trailer. She was not taking a personal day to process the public announcement that her marriage was over. She was on set in costume, in character, doing the thing that had cost her the marriage in the first place. And she was doing it because there was nothing else to do. The film would not wait. The crew would not wait. The only person who had wanted her to stop had already announced through his press agent that the relationship was finished. And still she was here, on a fake set inside a real studio, performing a fictional version of a nightmare that was beginning to resemble her actual life with an accuracy that no screenwriter could have planned. Mickey Rudin arrived on the set, Sinatra's lawyer. The man whose job it was to convert his client's displeasure into administrative action. Rodin did not come to negotiate. He did not come to deliver a message that might have been handled by telephone or by a private meeting at Farrow's home or by any of the quieter channels through which the dissolution of a celebrity marriage might have been managed with some minimal dignity. He came to the set. He came to the place where Mia Farrow's independence was most visible and most professionally necessary, the place where she had chosen work over obedience, and he handed her the divorce papers there. The act itself was brief. Legal documents changing hands, a transaction that takes seconds. But the meaning of the act was enormous, and the setting was the meaning. This was not a private legal proceeding. It was a public humiliation staged inside a workplace where Farrow was surrounded by colleagues, where she could not leave, where she was expected to continue performing after the blow landed. The message embedded in the delivery was unmistakable. If you will not leave this film for me, I will end this marriage inside this film. The divorce papers were both a legal instrument and a statement of dominance, delivered with the precision of a man who had spent his entire adult life understanding how to use timing and location to maximize impact. Farrow's own words about the moment spoken years later are the most useful thing in the available record, and they carry the weight of someone who lived through something she never fully processed into neat narrative. She said she thought it would not happen. That is the line. I just thought it wouldn't happen, but it did. 6 words that contain everything. The youth, the disbelief, the naivete that allowed her to believe that love would override the machinery, and the cold, mechanical fact that it did not. She was 22 years old. She was standing on a soundstage. She was dressed as a character who was learning that her husband had betrayed her in a way she could not yet fully comprehend. And a lawyer had just handed her the proof that her real husband had done something similar, not supernaturally, not with devil worship and conspiracy, but with the ordinary American tools of legal paperwork and the willingness to deploy them at the cruelest possible moment. The crew saw it happen. The production did not stop. That is perhaps the most brutal detail of all because it means that Farrow absorbed the blow and continued working. The film did not pause to accommodate her devastation. The schedule did not bend. The lights stayed on. The camera kept rolling, or would roll again shortly, and the woman in front of it was now carrying not just the emotional demands of the character, but the real and present wreckage of her own marriage, delivered to her feet like a package she had not ordered and could not return. A soundstage is not a private space. It is a room full of people who are pretending, for professional reason, not to see the things that happen between takes. The arguments, the breakdowns, the phone calls, the small human disasters that punctuate the mechanical process of making a film. On that day, the thing they were pretending not to see was the lead actress of their picture receiving legal confirmation that the most powerful man in American entertainment had decided to discard her because she would not come when he called. What happened in the hours immediately after is not detailed with granularity in the sources surfaced for this outline. What is known is that Farrow did not leave. She stayed. She finished the day's work. She came back the next day, and the day after that, and every day after that until principal photography wrapped on December 20th, 1967. Nearly a month of additional shooting, during which she performed the final acts of Rosemary Woodhouse's nightmare while living through the final chapter of her own. The film needed her, and she gave it what it needed because that is what her father had taught her work meant, and because by then the film was the only thing she had left that was entirely her own. The marriage had been taken. The public image of glamorous young bride had been shattered. The man she loved, and she did love him, in the complicated and not yet fully understood way that a 22-year-old loves the most powerful person she has ever known, had turned his legal apparatus against her in her workplace. What remained was the work itself, and so she did it. The marriage was over. The public knew it. The industry knew it. The press would write about it for weeks in the language of celebrity gossip, filing it alongside the decade's other glamorous casualties without pausing to examine the power dynamics underneath. The story, as the newspapers told it, was simple. Famous older man and younger wife could not make it work. Scheduling conflict, different lifestyles, an amicable parting, that was the version that fit inside a column inch. The version that protected everyone's reputation. the version that asked nothing of the reader and revealed nothing about the actual machinery of what had happened. The truth was uglier and more instructive, but the truth required understanding things about power, gender, and the architecture of celebrity marriage that the press of 1967 was neither equipped nor inclined to examine. But the full aftermath, what the divorce meant for Farrow's career, what the film became when it was finally released, what Frank Sinatra did next, and the strange, complicated tenderness that would persist between these two people for decades after the cruelty, had not yet played out. The story was not over. It was only entering its second act. Mia Farrow was 22 years old, newly served with divorce papers, and she had roughly 1 month of filming left on a movie about a woman who discovers that the people who claimed to love her had been working against her all along. She went back to work. Principal photography on Rosemary's Baby, wrapped on December 20th, 1967, nearly a month after the divorce papers had been served on set, and almost exactly a month after the separation had been announced to the press. Mia Farrow had done what she said she would do. She had stayed. She had finished every scene, hit every mark, performed every take that Polanski demanded, and she had done it while carrying the knowledge that the man she had married, the man she had believed would love her past his own anger, had chosen to punish her for precisely this act of professional commitment. That remaining month of production is not documented in the kind of day-by-day detail that a scriptwriter would wish for, but its shape can be inferred from what is known. Farrow was on set every working day. She was performing scenes that required emotional range. Terror, confusion, the dawning realization that the people closest to Rosemary Woodhouse had betrayed her in the most intimate way possible. She was doing this work in the same physical space where she had been handed the papers. The walls of the Bramford apartment set had not changed. The lights had not changed. The crew members who had witnessed the humiliation were still there, operating cameras, adjusting microphones, building the world of a film that was, with each passing day, moving closer to completion and further from the marriage that had tried to prevent its existence. Every morning Farrow arrived on that lot. She was choosing the film again, not dramatically, not with speeches, but with the quiet repetition of someone who gets up and goes to work because the alternative is to stop being the person she has decided to be. The film was in the can by December 20th. The marriage was over, and Mia Farrow, who had entered 1967 as the young wife of the most powerful entertainer in America, left it as something the industry had not expected her to become. A serious actress who had proven, under the worst possible circumstances, that she would not abandon her work for anyone. She was 22 years old. She had lost a marriage, endured a public humiliation, and completed a performance that would define her career. The cost had been enormous. The question of whether it had been worth it was one that only time and the film's reception could answer. The divorce was finalized in 1968. The legal proceedings were handled quietly, managed by the same apparatus that had managed the marriage. Lawyers, press agents, representatives whose job it was to ensure that the dissolution read publicly as civilized, even if the private reality had been anything but. Farrow did not contest it publicly. She did not give interviews about the humiliation on the set. She did not weaponize the story in the way that a more media-savvy or more vindictive person might have. She was 22 years old, and she absorbed the end of the marriage the way she had absorbed everything else that had happened to her since childhood. The polio, the death of her brother, the loss of her father, with a quietness that the press continued to misread as fragility, but that was in fact something closer to endurance. The girl who had been packaged as a waif was proving, in the wreckage of her first marriage, that she possessed something far more durable than the image had ever suggested. The ability to keep standing after the blow, to keep working after the humiliation, to refuse the role of victim even when the circumstances made that role the easiest one available. The months between the end of filming and the release of the picture were, for Farrow, a strange and suspended kind of limbo. She was no longer Sinatra's wife. The divorce proceedings were moving forward, managed by lawyers on both sides with the quiet efficiency that Hollywood applies to the dissolution of its most public unions. She was not yet the star that Rosemary's Baby would make her. She was something in between, a woman in transition, a woman whose public identity was being rewritten by forces she could not control, a woman waiting to see whether the film she had sacrificed her marriage to complete would justify the sacrifice or render it meaningless. The industry watched, the press speculated, and Farrow waited, carrying the weight of a decision whose consequences had not yet fully materialized. Sinatra, for his part, moved on with the particular velocity that powerful men move on with when the decision to end something has been theirs. He replaced Farrow in The Detective with Jacqueline Bisset. The film was released in 1968. It performed adequately, and the role that had been the pretext for the scheduling conflict that had detonated the marriage was filled by another actress without any visible disruption to the production or to Sinatra's career. That is worth sitting with for a moment because it means that the professional crisis Sinatra had used to justify his ultimatum, the urgent need for Farrow to leave Rosemary's Baby and come do his picture, was in the end entirely solvable without her. The role was recast. The film was made. The only thing that could not be replaced was the marriage, and the marriage had been the thing he chose to destroy. Whether he understood the irony of that sequence is not recorded. What is recorded is that Frank Sinatra continued to be Frank Sinatra, one of the most famous, most successful, most culturally significant performers in the history of American entertainment, and that his life, after Mia Farrow, contained no visible damage that the public or the industry could detect. He kept performing. He kept recording. He kept moving through the world with the particular authority of a man whose legend was now so firmly established that nothing, not the failure of a marriage, not the cruelty of its ending, not the slow cultural shift that would eventually reframe some of his behavior in the harsher light, could meaningfully diminish it. He married Barbara Marx in 1976, and that marriage lasted until his death, giving him the domestic stability that neither Ava Gardner nor Mia Farrow had provided on his terms. He remained, until the very end, protected by the mythology that had always shielded him. The voice, the swagger, the legend of a man who lived by his own rules and whose rules the world was expected to accommodate. Rosemary's Baby opened in June 1968, and it did something that the marriage's collapse had made possible, but that no one had predicted with confidence. It made Mia Farrow a star on terms that had nothing to do with Frank Sinatra. The film was a commercial sensation. It set box office records in New York and Los Angeles during its opening engagements. It became Paramount's highest grossing release of the summer. It earned Farrow a Golden Globe nomination for Best Actress, recognition that came not because she was a celebrity wife, but because she had delivered a performance of genuine depth and skill under circumstances that would have broken most actors twice her age. Critics treated the film not as a genre exercise, but as a genuine work of psychological art, a film that used the architecture of horror to say something true and disturbing about what it felt like to be a young woman in a world where the people who claimed to care for you had already decided your fate without asking your permission. The success of the film did something else too, something that the outline of this story cannot skip past because it is central to the meaning of everything that came before. It proved that Mia Farrow had been right. Not right in the moral sense alone, though the moral dimension is real. She had honored her commitment. She had finished the work. She had refused to let someone else's authority override her professional obligation. She had also been right in the practical sense that the film she fought to complete was worth completing. Rosemary's Baby was not a minor picture that justified a minor sacrifice. It was a major work of American cinema, one that would endure for decades, and her performance was its beating heart. The movie that Frank Sinatra had tried to stop his wife from finishing became the movie that permanently defined her career. The role he had demanded she abandon became the role the public would associate with her name for the rest of her life. There is a particular kind of justice in that outcome, though it is not the clean, triumphant kind that stories like this want to deliver. It is the kind of justice that arrives too late to prevent the damage, too publicly to feel like private vindication, and too complicated to separate from the pain that made it possible. The film succeeded, the marriage failed, and the connection between those two facts, that the success was only possible because she refused to let the marriage dictate her choices, as the thread that runs through every remaining chapter of this story. The cultural afterlife of Rosemary's Baby has only deepened in the decades since its release. The Criterion Collection, the gold standard for film preservation and canonization, has called it a landmark psychological thriller and an indelible portrait of a woman victimized by authority, society, and the people closest to her. The film's reputation has grown from commercial hit to canonical work of American cinema, studied in film programs, referenced in cultural criticism, and revisited by audiences who find in Rosemary Woodhouse's Nightmare a metaphor that remains uncomfortably relevant to conversations about bodily autonomy, institutional betrayal, and the ways in which women's choices are constrained by the men and systems around them. And embedded in that cultural afterlife, whether the audience knows it or not, is the real story of the woman who played Rosemary, a 22-year-old actress whose off-screen experience during the making of the film mirrored the on-screen horror with an exactness that no screenwriter could have designed. The husband in the film trades his wife's autonomy for his own ambition. The husband in real life demanded his wife's career be sacrificed for his authority. The character discovers that the institutions meant to protect her are complicit in her subjugation. The actress discovered that the industry she worked in would protect its investment in her, but had no interest in protecting her as a person. The movie Sinatra tried to kill is the artifact that kept this story alive, the thing that ensured the marriage would be remembered not as another celebrity footnote, but as a story with something to say about power, gender, and the cost of being a woman who chose to work in a world that had not yet decided she was allowed to. That is not irony the script needs to announce. It is irony the audience will feel on their own. What complicates the aftermath, and what rescues this story from the simplicity of a villain and victim narrative, is what happened between Sinatra and Farrow in the years and decades that followed the divorce. They did not become enemies. They did not disappear from each other's lives. They did not allow the cruelty of the ending to be the final word. The relationship transformed quietly and without the kind of public drama that had attended its destruction into something that defied easy categorization, something warmer than friendship, more honest than nostalgia, and more durable than anyone who witnessed the onset humiliation could have predicted. Farrow spoke of Sinatra in later years with a warmth that surprised people who knew only the divorce papers on the set version of the story. She said he had a temper. She was honest about that, and the honesty matters because it keeps the story grounded in reality rather than sentiment. But she also said that the essential person underneath the temper was compassionate and shy, that there was a private Frank Sinatra who bore little resemblance to the public monument, and that this private person had been in his way genuinely loving. She called him the great love of her life. She said they never really split up emotionally. Those words, coming from the woman who had been served divorce papers on a soundstage in front of a film crew, carry a weight that no biographer or documentarian can manufacture. They are the words of someone who lived inside a contradiction. A marriage that was both controlling and tender, both humiliating and formative, both the worst thing that had happened to her and the relationship against which all subsequent relationships would be measured, and who refused to flatten the contradiction into a story that was easier to tell. That refusal to simplify is, in the end, one of the most remarkable things about Mia Farrow's account of this marriage. She had every reason to tell the easy version. She had every reason to cast herself as the innocent victim of a powerful man's ego, to reduce the marriage to a cautionary tale, to turn the onset humiliation into the final and definitive truth of who Frank Sinatra was. She chose not to. She chose instead to hold the full complexity. The love and the control, the tenderness and the cruelty, the man who kissed her instead of answering her question about the litter box, and the man who sent his lawyer to her workplace with divorce papers. Both of those men were Frank Sinatra. Both of those experiences were her marriage, and she carried both of them without resolution for the rest of her life. Sinatra remained a presence in Farrow's emotional landscape for the rest of his life. The details of their post-divorce contact are not extensively documented in the public record, but Farrow's later statements suggest a connection that persisted across marriages, across decades, across the vast distances that both of their lives traveled after 1967. Whatever form that connection took, phone calls, occasional meetings, the quiet persistence of a bond that neither person chose to sever completely. It outlasted the anger, the humiliation, and the 30-year gap between the divorce and the end of Sinatra's life. That persistence is itself a kind of evidence. It suggests that something in the marriage had been genuine, that the love of Farrow, later described, had not been manufactured or projected backward onto a relationship she needed to romanticize. It had been real. It had coexisted with the control, the temper, the apparatus, the cruelty of the paper on the set. Both things were true at once, and Farrow, to her credit, never pretended otherwise. When Frank Sinatra died in Los Angeles on May 14th, 1998, at the age of 82, Farrow attended to his passing in a way that reveals more about the marriage than the divorce papers ever could. She left her wedding ring in his coffin. That single detail, a piece of jewelry from a marriage that had lasted 16 months, placed in the casket of a man who had humiliated her 31 years earlier, is the kind of fact that resists interpretation and demands it simultaneously. It is not the act of a woman who had forgiven everything. It is not the act of a woman who had forgotten anything. It is the act of a woman who understood that the marriage had been real, that the love had been real, that the damage had been real, and that all of those things could coexist inside a single relationship without canceling each other out. She was 53 years old. She had built an entire life after him, a long acting career, other relationships, a large and unconventional family of her own. And still, when the moment came, she gave back the ring. Not because the marriage had worked, because it had mattered. Farrow's life, after Sinatra, unfolded on a scale and in directions that the 22-year-old girl on the Paramount soundstage could not have imagined. She continued acting, building a filmography that moved through the 1970s and 80s with the steady accumulation of someone who treated her craft as work rather than identity performance, a habit she had learned from her parents and that had survived everything the Sinatra marriage had tried to do to it. She appeared in important films. She took risks. She built over the following decades the long and productive collaboration with Woody Allen that would define her middle career and that would eventually produce its own devastating chapter of private betrayal, made public. But that is another story, one that belongs to a different set of wounds and a different reckoning. And this story does not require it. What matters here is that the marriage to Sinatra did not define Mia Farrow's life. It was the first act of a much longer narrative, and the woman who emerged from it was not the waif the press had packaged or the victim the gossip columns had pitied. She was a working actress who had proven at 22 and under the most humiliating circumstances imaginable that her professional identity could survive the withdrawal of the most powerful protection Hollywood had to offer. Beyond acting, Farrow built a second life of purpose that extended far past the entertainment industry and that the 21-year-old bride at the Sands Hotel could never have predicted. She became a UNICEF Goodwill ambassador in 2000, campaigning for children affected by armed conflict in some of the most dangerous regions on Earth, work that had nothing to do with glamour, nothing to do with celebrity, and everything to do with the kind of moral seriousness that the press of the 1960s had never credited her with possessing. The girl who had been photographed at Las Vegas tables trying to talk about cats grew into a woman whose commitments took her to war zones and refugee camps, to the offices of international advocacy organizations, to places where the name Sinatra meant nothing and the name Farrow meant someone who showed up. It is worth noting that showing up, the same principle that had cost her the marriage, became the defining ethic of her humanitarian career. She did not stop doing it after the set. She carried it forward. As of now, Mia Farrow is 81 years old. She lives in Connecticut. She is still publicly active, still working, still refusing to be defined by the version of her story that begins and ends with the men she was married to. In 2024, she returned to Broadway in the production of The Roommate, and in 2025, she received a Tony nomination for Best Actress in a Play, a recognition that arrived nearly 6 decades after the marriage that was supposed to define her and that she outlasted by more than half a century. She is not frozen in 1967. She is not the girl on the soundstage. She is not the waif, not the ingenue, not the delicate creature the press invented and the culture consumed. She is a woman who has lived a full and complicated life, marked by joy and devastation in measures that few people would volunteer for. And the marriage to Sinatra, however formative, however painful, however strange and tender in its long aftermath, occupies a particular chapter of that life. It does not occupy its center. Sinatra is gone. He has been gone for more than 25 years. His voice remains on records, in films, in the vast archive of American popular culture that he helped create. But the man himself, with his temper and his shyness and his need to be obeyed and his capacity for unexpected tenderness, exists now only in the memories of the people who knew him and in the stories they choose to tell. Farrow's stories about him are among the most generous, which is itself a kind of testament to something the divorce papers could not destroy. His absence does not simplify the story of the marriage. If anything, the passage of time has made it harder to reduce to a single interpretation, because the two people involved refused to reduce it themselves. Farrow did not spend the rest of her life publicly condemning Sinatra. Sinatra did not spend the rest of his life publicly dismissing Farrow. Something between them survived the wreckage. Call it love, call it regret, call it the particular bond that forms between two people who once tried to build a life together and failed in a way that was visible to the entire country. And whatever it was, it persisted quietly, beneath the headlines and behind the public images for 31 years, until the day she placed a ring in his coffin, closed whatever remained of that chapter, and walked away into the rest of her life. Hollywood did not simply misread this marriage, it needed to misread it. Frank Sinatra and Mia Farrow, 50 and 21, looked like a glamorous intergenerational romance, only as long as nobody asked what the arrangement actually required of her. Only as long as nobody noticed that the fairy tale had terms and conditions, and that every one of them was written by the same person. The moment her work mattered as much as his authority, the whole construction collapsed. And what was revealed underneath was not a love story gone wrong, but a power structure exposed by the single act it could not absorb, a young woman choosing to finish her job. What remains is not a lesson about monsters and innocence, because Frank Sinatra was not a monster and Mia Farrow was not merely innocent. What remains is a story about the cost of being loved by a man the culture had decided should never be refused, and about a woman who refused him anyway, not out of courage or ideology, but because her father had taught her that you do not walk off a film.